Hello students, welcome to the lecture on interest groups. And after this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Explain the historic development for interest groups. Define the role of interest. Discuss the post-Cold War. Introduction. Let's start with interest groups. Interest groups are one important mechanism through which citizens in the United States make their ideas, needs and views known to elected officials. Citizens can usually find an interest group that focuses on their conficials. Citizens can usually find an interest group that focuses on their concerns, no matter how specialized they may be. One feature of the American system that enhances their influence in the relative weakness of US political parties, which stems in part from the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. A second feature of the system that encourages interest groups is the decentralization of political power to states and localities known as the federal system or federalism. An interest group in any organization that seeks to influence public policy. Interest groups are found in many societies, but there are an unusually large number of them in United States. History development for interest groups. Although interest groups are rooted in different traditions in Germany and the United States, there are common threads that can be observed in the development of interest group systems in all Western industrial societies. Four phases can be distinguished in the development of interest groups. During the first pre-industrial phase from the 1830s to 1870s, charitable organizations assisting the poor represented the dominant form of association. Membership in these organizations consisted mostly of middle-class citizens. The second phase corresponds to the process of industrialization between the 1860s and the early 1900s. During this time, group membership began to cross class lines. This period saw the establishment of economic groups such as trade unions and employers' organizations. The third phase lasted from 1920 to the late 1950s and was characterized by the emergence of professional associations and promotional groups. The fourth and present phase can be regarded as a product of post-industrialism. It is characterized by the rise of groups promoting post-industrial values, environmental issues, and civil rights. World War I. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. On April 4, 1917, the US Senate voted in support of the measure to declare war on Germany. The House concurred 2 days later. The United States later declared war on Austria-Hungary on December 7, 1917. Germany's resumption of submarine attacks on passenger and merchant ships in 1917 was the primary motivation behind Wilson's decision to lead the United States into World War I. By January 1917, however, the situation in Germany had changed. During a wartime conference that month, representatives from the German Navy convinced the military leadership and Kaiser Wilhelm II that a resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare could help defeat Great Britain within 5 months. The precise reasons for Wilson's decision to choose war in 1917 remain the subject of debate among historians, especially in light of his efforts to avoid war in 1915 after the sinking of the British passenger liners Lusitania and Arabic, which had led to the deaths of 131 Americans. Cold War. The Cold War was a decades-long struggle for global supremacy that pitted the capitalist United States against the communist Soviet Union. Although there are some disagreements as to when the Cold War began, it is generally conceded that mid to late 1945 marks the time when relations between Moscow and Washington began deteriorating. Interestingly, for the first few years of the early Cold War, between 1945 and 1948, the conflict was more political than military. Both sides squabbled with each other at the UN, sought closer relations with nations that were not committed to either side, and articulated their differing visions of a post-war world. By the end of the 1970s, however, the chance for an extended thaw had utterly vanished. Jimmy Carter had been elected president in 1976, and although he was able to hammer out a second arms limitation agreement with Brezhnev, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan significantly soured US-Soviet relations. The following year, Americans overwhelmingly elected a president who spoke of waging the Cold War with even greater intensity than had any of his predecessors, and Ronald Reagan made good on his promises by dramatically increasing military budgets in the early 1980s. World War II ends. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was the largest armed conflict in human history. Ranging over 6 continents and all the world's oceans, the war caused an estimated 50 million military and civilian deaths, including those of 6 million Jews. World War II created a new world at home and abroad. Among its major results were the beginning of the nuclear era, increased pressure to decolonize the Third World, and the advent of the Cold War. The war also ended America's relative isolation from the rest of the world and resulted in the creation of the United Nations. Domestically, the war ended the Great Depression as hundreds of thousands of people, many of them women, went into the defense industries. At the same time, African Americans made significant strides towards achieving their political, economic, and social rights. The roots of World War II, which eventually pitted Germany, Japan, and Italy against the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the Allies, lay in the militaristic ideologies and expansionist policies of Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Although the war began with Nazi Germany's attack on Poland in September 1939, the United States did not enter the war until after the Japanese bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941. The role of interest groups. Interest groups are one important mechanism through which citizens in the United States make their ideas, needs, and views known to elected officials. Both the formal structure and the informal traditions of American politics provide fertile ground for interest groups. One feature of the American system that enhances their influence is the relative weakness of US political parties, which stems in part from the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. In addition, a strong independent judiciary in the American system enhances the power of interest groups. US courts often rule on issues that in other democratic politics would be under the control of the legislature or bureaucracy. Thus, interest groups can utilize litigation to achieve policy objectives that they cannot obtain through legislative action. The universe of interest groups. Before 1970, the typical American textbook on interest groups devoted most of its pages to 3 categories: business, labor, and agriculture. Since then, the interest group universe has become much more complicated. Agricultural groups have lost influence due to the declining number of farmers in the United States. Business. Most scholars would agree that business plays a central role in American politics. Major corporations carry the prestige of being important players in the US economy. They are usually members of multiple trade associations which represent an entire industry's views in the political process. Corporations also support umbrella groups such as the National Association of Manufacturers and the US Chamber of Commerce that speak for the whole business community. Labor unions. Labor unions grew slowly in the early part of the 20th century, but they gained a significant place in the American political system in the 1930s. The National Labor Relations Act protected collective bargaining and enabled unions to grow much faster. They reached a peak membership of 35% of the labor force in the 1950s. Professional associations. Another important type of interest group is the association of professionals. Groups like the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association focus on the collective interests, values, and status of their profession. Intergovernmental groups. A related category consists of interest groups representing units of state and local government, lobbying for their interests on the national level. While these groups have no official role in the US federal system that divides authority among national, state, and local governments, they function much as other interest groups do. Public interest groups. The type of interest group experiencing the most rapid growth since 1970 is the public interest group. Political scientist Jeffrey Berry defines a public interest group as one that supports goals that are not of direct material benefit to its members, but rather express their values pertaining to society as a whole. Public interest groups generally lack the financial resources of business groups. While the issues they champion often enjoy considerable public support, according to opinion polls, few have mass memberships. Number and cohesion of members. It would seem logical to assume that interest groups with a large base of support in the population would be the most influential. It is true that millions of citizens belong to interest groups and that some, such as the environmentalist Sierra Club and the AFL-CIO, the labor organization, are quite large. However, a closer look shows that most mass membership groups enroll only a small fraction of their potential supporters. Money. The importance of money in American politics has increased in recent years due to the escalating costs of political campaigns. Interest groups that are most influential in national elections generally make voluntary contributions to candidates totaling in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money also interacts with the factors of membership and cohesion. In order to overcome the free rider problem, groups must attract policy entrepreneurs, that is, individuals who seek material, professional, or ideological rewards from organizing a successful group. Post-Cold War. The end of the Cold War had a triple significance for world affairs: the defeat of one power by another, the triumph of one political ideology over another, and the discrediting of one economic model in favor of another. All three have now been attenuated. The Cold War was a global and transcendental struggle centered on and led by the Soviet Union and the United States. Between 1989-91, the Soviet Union imploded and collapsed as a major power, leaving the United States as the only remaining superpower. The commanding position of the US as a power was quite astonishing and heady, and indeed it went to the heads of the neocons. Triumph of liberal democracy. The second dimension of the US victory in the Cold War was the triumph of the ideology of liberal democracy and political pluralism over communism. Intoxicated by this success, the neocons not only declared history to be at an end, although Francis Fukuyama later recanted on Iraq. They decided also to export democracy riding tank turrets and helicopter gunships. Iraq marks the graveyard of this democratic enterprise as well. When lectured by President George W. Bush at the St. Petersburg G8 summit, Vladimir Putin commented caustically that Russia could do without Iraq-style democracy. The US military remains unchallengeable for the foreseeable future in its core tasks of asserting itself on the battlefield, particularly in the defense of genuinely vital US interests. The US economy is still the world's and the best balanced, most productive and most innovative in the world. Summary. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learnt in this lecture. Explain the historic development for interest groups, define the role of interest, discuss the post-Cold War.